Good afternoon. Are you sitting comfortably, students? Because today is a big lecture. This is one of my more favorite ones to give. These last two lectures I feel like are my favorite to give in a class. We're talking about World War II in California and the massive changes that come with it. In the syllabus, this is listed as two separate topics, but this is just going to be one 2-hour long video. That covers the entirety of World War II and Japanese internment. This picture you're looking at right here, taken in Oakland and in Oakland, Chinatown, right by one of my old houses, actually. It's at the corner of 13th and Franklin Street, which is now the Oakland Chinatown, but this was owned by a Japanese-American man who was a citizen, graduate of UC Berkeley, who the day after Pearl Harbor would put this sign up in front of his store. That man would eventually, though, the store would be closed because he and his family would be indefinitely detained along with many other Japanese Americans in California. But we'll get to that. So there's a lot to cover in this. There's a lot of, we got a lot of learning goals here. We're going to talk about many different kinds of groups of people and how things changed for all of those groups. But to fully explain it, I need to give a little bit of background. I can't assume that you know everything about how World War II started. So I can talk a little bit about that. Not give a huge amount of world history in this, but let's get it started. The war, at least the war in the Pacific. The war in Europe doesn't really concern us. The war in the Pacific, very important. So, last we've talked about Japan. We talked about them being a rising power. I talked about how in 1905 they beat Russia in a war, you know, this great European empire, and everybody saw sort of Japan on the rise, even if they weren't, you know, Japanese Americans weren't being treated very well. I should say Japanese immigrants, more likely. They weren't Japanese Americans yet. We're getting to the stage of where they are Japanese Americans. But we weren't treated that well in the US, but you know, they had some, you know, diplomatic clout because Japan was this rising power. Since Japan had reopened to the world in the middle of the 19th century, like I said, it had modernized incredibly quickly, completely restructured its form of government, its military, its industry, business practices, the way they did everything. And they were really good at it. They still had a very much a sense of sort of superiority, a sense of that Japanese culture had a historic right to all of Asia, that they were a superior people of Asia, and eventually they become the Japanese Empire, and that empire would be very expansive, very aggressive. We hear lots about you know, the Nazis during World War II, you know, Nazi Germany, but in lots of ways, Imperial Japan was every bit as racist and every bit as belligerent and bent on world domination. So anyhow, in pursuing that goal, first they had taken Korea, and then in 1931, they move up into Manchuria, right here. And the reason they did this, a relatively unpopulated region, but there was lots of minerals there to be used, that because Japan is not, you know, it's an island that it doesn't have all the resources you need for, you know, a world dominating military machine. So they needed some of these precious minerals up in here. So they move up there, stir up some trouble, for sure, upset the balance of power. But like I said, it's relatively unpopulated, and everybody was kind of like, well, you shouldn't be doing that, Japan, but not really, you know, not ready to go to war over it. Then by the mid-30s, they start taking pieces of China. Like I said, China had been very destabilized for the last century. and it was at the, kind of this historic weak point in Chinese history. So Japan had started. You can see these little bubbles that they show up along the coast and start conquering little pieces of China and moving in here. Now, the US did not like this one bit. Not necessarily because they were super sympathetic to the Chinese people. We've seen, the general sort of racist view Americans had of Chinese culture, but because it was upsetting the balance of power. It's not great when nations go out and start conquering giant chunks of a continent. The U.S. has trade deals. They have interests in the Pacific. They have territories in the Pacific. That the Philippines is in blue here because at this time the Philippines is a U.S. territory. It's the same status as Hawaii is right here. Same status as Alaska is up here. They're not states, but they're U.S. territories. So they do not like Japan being this aggressive. And Franklin Roosevelt basically puts Japan on notice, saying like, hey, you need to stop what you're doing, or we're going to stop selling you oil. One of the resources Japan did not have a lot of was oil. And that's really important when you're getting tanks and jeeps and all the kind of stuff that you need to go out conquering the world. And they're buying most of that oil from the US, and really specifically from California, from Southern California, from Los Angeles. A lot of that oil is being pumped out along the coast here and being sent in Japan. And Franklin Roosevelt said, no more of that. We're not going to give you any more oil if you keep conquering. So Japan has a choice. Do we halt our war machine and keep buying oil from the US? Or are we going to continue with the plan of world domination and find some other source of oil? And everybody kind of knew what their decision was going to be, said, okay, fine, we'll get our oil somewhere else. Roosevelt puts an embargo on selling oil to Japan, so they're not getting any more oil from the United States. And there is an area close by, right along here, which is what's now Indonesia, in these countries here, that is very oil rich. There's a lot of water, or there's a lot of oil under the water and islands along here. It's not too far for them to go. So they start conquering these islands along here, and nobody ever had any doubt for a second that they're going to have to go through the Philippines, this pretty, good size, set of islands along here that is U.S. territory. Everybody expected that, and it was really a matter of time before, like, when's the U.S. gonna, or when's Japan gonna attack, Manila? Or other bases in the Philippines, and they're just kind of sitting and waiting. Where they did not expect an attack was way over here in the Hawaiian Islands, where was the headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Navy. It was not a huge Pacific fleet at this time. There had not really needed to be, but it was growing. There's some aircraft carriers and battleships along over here, but that's a long way from Japan to Hawaii. That's a long distance to be, to make it across the ocean, especially without the U.S. knowing about it. If there's this huge fleet moving across the ocean, people would see it. There's planes, some planes would be going by overhead. People are watching out for it. This is before we have satellites and things like that to check for that kind of stuff. But it would be noticeable. So Hawaii was considered to be relatively safe where they're expecting an attack on the Philippines. Nevertheless, of course, that on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Empire does attack Pearl Harbor and totally catches them with their pants down, totally by surprise attack. And it turned out that Japan had really carefully plotted this attack. They had sent aircraft carriers like far apart, so they would, they wouldn't. It's not one fleet traveling together, and they had to basically maintain radio silence. So they all have to like take off and plan that they're going to be able to meet the same place and coordinate this attack with very limited communication between each other. So that's pretty, just logistically, that's a tough feat to pull off, but they did. And they had spies in Hawaii We know there was at least some there that had been scouting the Pearl Harbor base, and apparently they had a guy that was like making sketches of the photography maybe would have been too noticeable or something, and sketches could maybe even be a little more accurate in a way when you're trying to see like, oh, here's where the oil depots are, here's where the arms here's where they store missiles and things like that. And the guy would apparently even had hired a taxi to basically like circle around that part of the island while he like sketched like looking out the window. But they did pull it off. And Japan's play in this, with this surprise attack, was to hit the U.S. really hard right now, give them a bloody nose before they're even in the fight, and they said the U.S. is going to back down. They said the U.S. is a paper tiger. They said, this is a nation of merchants, cowardly merchants at that. They're not a nation of warriors. If we hit them hard right now, the American public is going to say, hey, we want to stay out of this war. And generally, as World War II had been escalating in Asia and in Europe, I don't know about most, but yeah, I'd say, I guess most Americans had said, we want to stay out of that. They had opted for isolation and didn't want anything to do with the war. So Japan's bet was like, well, this is just going to scare them off even further, and they're going to back off and let us take the oil down in Indonesia. Well, it turned out that America was not a paper tiger. The analogy that would be made afterward is that they woke a sleeping giant. This nation that had not really been known for war capabilities. The U.S. was not a superpower at this point. It had been growing economically, but it didn't really even have much of a standing military. So that will all change. That rather than getting a bloody nose and backing down and saying like, we want to stay out of the fight, they got up and said, Captain American style, I can do this all day. And Franklin Roosevelt goes in front of Congress the next day, gives a very famous speech for why we need to go to war against Japan. And Roosevelt had been wanting this anyway. He thought we needed to combat Germany and Japan before they got too strong, but the American public was not with him. So this is, now everybody else could see the same threat that he had been warning them about. And said we need to declare a war on Japan. All Congress, all except for one votes to go to war. Janet Rankin, who was the first woman elected to Congress, and by a weird sort of like fluke of history, she had been elected twice as a congresswoman in 20 years apart. So she voted to go against World War I, and then voted to go against World War II. Just because she's a pacifist and didn't believe in any wars. But this is a side note here. So then Germany was allied with Japan. So that, if we go to war against Japan, Germany declares war on us, we declare war on Germany, and boom, US is full blown into World War II. Okay. Most of those details will be important going forward. Most of it isn't necessarily stuff I'm going to ask you to remember. I just want you to get the context here. So the immediate effect of that is they are going to need to rebuild the Pacific Fleet that just got destroyed. All aircraft carriers that were stationed in and around Hawaii were destroyed except for two that had been out on drills and practices and stuff like that. So they weren't in the harbor. So they need to, and they're going to fight this incredibly powerful military empire of Japan. They need to build, not just rebuild a Pacific Fleet, but like build it better than ever. So where better to do that but in California? Generally, most naval ships were not, they're all on the East Coast, and then they would make their way into the Pacific. But if we're going to be fighting this war in the Pacific, then it makes sense. We'll do it on a U.S. state that borders in the Pacific. So California, Oregon, and Washington are all going to have an escalation, but no more than California. And just overnight, they're going to have to build all the stuff that you need to be able to fight a war. So yeah, it's going to be ships, it's going to be planes, it's going to be tanks, jeeps, boots, guns, bullets, uniforms, all of those type of stuff that you need that had not existed in California. Those type of factories are going to just be built practically overnight, and they're going to need people to work in those factories. They're going to need hands to be able to weld together airplanes and all that type of stuff. So this is going to be a giant shift in the economy of California, and it's going to dramatically change the demographics in California, because there's all of these jobs. The people of California, there's not enough of them to be able to do that. People are going to be coming into California to be able to work in these jobs, and it's going to wreak havoc on the housing market. But we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. So all these people are going to be coming in, and they're not going to be able to be picky anymore for these jobs about who they hire. They are, 1940s is generally, people were more racist, than they are now. There's not a ton of laws protecting against discrimination. There was a recent law passed that you can't discriminate on race if you're a company with a U.S. government contract. But anybody with two hands and a brain, we need them on the factory floor doing this stuff. And so this is going to mean, like I said, lots of Afro Americans coming here, lots of Latin American people are going to be working these jobs, and then this is the Great Migration part. I'd kind of teased the Great Migration in recent lecture. This is the second wave of the Great Migration in the 1940s that is really going to be all about Black Southerners migrating to California cities, and they're going to come into cities where those jobs are. Places like Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, Richmond. That's where they're going to be settling. And again, we're going to see the effects of that play out in the next lecture, when we talk about sort of urban life in California in the 50s and 60s and how that sort of gave rise to the Black Panthers. That's next week. But for now, just know there's a lot of Black people coming in looking for and getting all of these jobs. Also, very famously, going into the workforce are women. It's, many of the men are going to enlist to be able to fight in this war. So that's good. There'll be less men in general, and they just need all kinds of people to be able to do this. So, it was just almost unthinkable to have women be like working in a factory, welding, riveting, sheet cutting, pieces of metal, all of that stuff was just thought that's man's work. Women can't do stuff like that. But turns out women can do that. It turns out that women are every bit as capable at working machines, at picking things up and doing all this kind of stuff. So where there had been for a long time this idea of this is not for you. There'll be this whole shift of like, it's your patriotic duty. You need to support our boys on the front line by going to work in these factories. Then of course, Rosie the Riveter. There's no person that actually was named Rosie, who was a riveter. She was a mascot in these sort of advertisements to encourage women, again, that's your patriotic duty to come do this. But there was still a lot of fretting about, can women do this? So it became obvious women can physically do it, but it was sort of the thing, like, should they do it? Will they become too masculine, or at least be less feminine if they start getting stronger and having muscles, and they're getting dirty? Their fingernails are getting dirty, and they're doing all this stuff. Like, it sounds insane to say it now, but like will women still be women? Are men still going to be attracted to them? Like, are men still going to want to have sex with women who work in factories? Oh my gosh. You know, like that was really a conversation. And one of the things that changed that conversation and sort of eased people's minds a little bit is this picture you're seeing right here, of a woman who lived and worked in Alameda, California, out on the island in a factory that was, and she ends up being what we think of as probably the model for Rosie the Riveter, because this was a very, very famous picture that just a little bit predated the Rosie advertisement campaign. So Naomi Parker, I don't know actually much about like her personal life to go into, but when this picture went out, it was published in newspapers across the country. You know, here's one in, you know, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and, you know, well-dressed woman worker, and this sort of put people's minds at ease, because here was Miss Parker in, you know, the work, you know, jumper. You know, practical dress for, you know, being, you know, working in a factory. She's got her hair back, and, you know, she's still got her long hair, but she's got it, you know, safely back, you know, back under the bandana and stuff. But she also is pretty. She's also still fashionable. She has shoes with heels on. She has makeup on. You know, she still looks like a beautiful woman. People like go and like, oh, well, I guess then, you know, women can maintain feminine beauty and be able to do this stuff. And again, you know, by our woke standards of 2020, it sounds sort of ridiculous to sort of react this way. But, you know, people's minds needed easing in this form. There would be, what's my, okay, now, just a little side note here. This would be a kind of the spark for second wave feminism in lots of ways, because women are going to enjoy working for themselves. They're going to learn skills that they did not know they necessarily had, that they told they didn't possess. They're going to find out they had them. And almost more importantly, like, you know, they're going to be getting paychecks, their paychecks, not paychecks to their husband or anybody else that they have to work of. You know, it's financial independence that you're getting from this. And when the war ends, men are going to come back from the front lines and largely go back into those jobs. And it's going to be a full reversal of being like, oh, women, now you are, you know, now your job is to go back into the home, you know, support your husband, have babies, and stay in the kitchen. And that's, you know, that's the life you lead. And a lot of those women are going to be saying like, I remember, you know, when I was given skills, when I got a promotion, you know, when I had my own paycheck, and now, you know, the biggest thing I'm supposed to do today is mop the floor and change diapers. You know, for a lot of women, yes, that's fine, you know, to do that, but a lot of women just wanted more. So this is gonna be a dramatic shift. And again, it'll sort of be why California will sort of be more progressive as far as women, or, you know, and women's rights and things like that, because a lot of these women lived in California who would have these jobs. This is actually a link right here if you wanted to look on this later, for this crazy, this guide offers patronizing advice, male bosses for female employees. It was basically to teach men, like male managers, how to manage women when they had never done that before. And it's just insane, like the things like that, like women are teachable. Did you know that the women are intelligent enough? Like if you show them how to do something, then later on they'll remember and be able to repeat those actions. It's a novel concept, but yeah, they thought they had to like teach people that, which apparently they did. So I don't know, if you want to have a little bit of a laugh, it's a little bit sad, you can click on that later. So like I said, a lot of these Rosies are going to be in California. A lot of them are going to be working at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, just a little bit north of me. You guys, you know where Richmond is. There's actually a Rosie the Riveter museum there. That the Kaiser Shipyard produced more ships than any other shipyard in World War II. They're incredibly effective, and they also hired more women than anywhere else. There was a great documentary that came out in the 80s when these women were, still, a little bit past middle age, but they're not elderly yet, but and then they're able, and then they could talk about their experiences. And one of the things that's notable is that these are women of multiple colors. The black, white, and Latinas working alongside each other, forging these friendships, people that would not have otherwise interacted. Here they are together, making these ships, and then they start hanging out outside of work and forging these sort of lifelong friendships. And like I said, in doing so, making a massive amount of ships that will win us World War II. So I don't know. Have you ever up in Richmond? The Rosie the River Museum is worth a stop. There's all kinds of interesting stuff along the shoreline there these days. So yeah, Richmond it might not be everything you've heard about it might not necessarily be true. So I'm going to continue this theme and talking about the different kinds of people who are going to work in these factories and tell some stories. But one of them is going to be this Lockheed Martin aerospace factory in Los Angeles where they made airplanes. But before I do that, this is just, I think it's just a cool sort of side note. So the pictures you're seeing here are actually the same place. This is what the shipyard looked like before. But here it is on the coast in Los Angeles, and Hawaii had just been bombed, and we didn't think Japan was capable of that. So a lot of people thought it was probable that Japan was going to try to bomb California. And where are they going to target first? Well, they're going to try and hit our military industrial facilities. They're going to try and hit the places that are making planes, that destroys American war-making capabilities. So they're like, how do we cover up this giant factory that we have here? So they made this tarp/net, this kind of painted net thing. That this is all fake. You're seeing here. This is a tarp. This is what it looks like underneath, right here. And the parking lot, the actual the hangar and everything. And if you're a few hundred feet up in the air, a Japanese bomber looking down, but first glance you're like, where the hell's the airplane factory? And you're not necessarily going to know. And that's just cool. That's just a great piece of sort of American ingenuity, of the can-do attitude, of being like, well, all right, well, we need to cover up this factory. Was put a tarp over it, and I don't know. I like it. So anyhow, one of the women who is going to be working there is a woman that you're not going to see in very many history books at all. She's not at all a famous person, not a great leader. I read the book that has like a page and a half about her, but I think her story is perfectly indicative of this larger change that was going on in terms of race relations at these places. Margarita Salazar was a 25-year-old Mexican-American woman who lived in East LA that was working at a beauty parlor when the war broke out. But these factories had gone up, and she knew some other people who had applied and gotten jobs at Lockheed Martin, so she did as well. And she gets the job. Like I said, like in most other circumstances, they would not hire a 25-year-old Latina into this type of position, but she's an intelligent and capable person. So like, all right, get her in there. And she's stoked. She's making way more money than she ever has. She feels really good about doing something for her country. It's like every day she goes to work being like, I'm supporting the war effort and doing this. But it quickly finds that the different races at the factory are very self-segregated in lots of ways. The black people hang out with black people, the white people hang out with white people, the Mexican Americans hang out with the Mexican Americans, and there's not a lot of cross between them. But over time, that begins to change a little bit. A manager puts a lot of the Black and Latino women on the same work detail. And they start working, and the greatest way to conquer any sort of racism is just working alongside, just getting to know somebody, and whatever stereotypes that you had about that person's race, like, oh, wait a minute, you're actually a complex human being. And that's the greatest way to defeat racism. And they're and that sort of divide they had breaks down, and they start hanging out on in the cafeteria and things like that. And pretty soon now the white women are the minority there. And she talks about a bunch of white women from Missouri that were kind of racist towards all the other women, but they felt like really sort of left out of this whole thing. And but eventually, over time, that breaks down. People, they start talking, and the white women join the group, and they all become friends. They're all going to each other's birthday parties and barbecues, and forming these real friendships over time. And she talks about how, like, prejudice was seriously stamped out. It wasn't just a thing that was sort of naturally happening, like that was, but also, like, since they are all doing this for the war effort, they're doing this, their patriotic duty to help win this war and do this stuff. If somebody's racist attitude, like, I don't want to work with that person. If someone's doing that kind of stuff, like, hey, we don't care about what you want to do or about what stupid prejudices you have or anything like that. We need to get this plane built so it could go drop bombs on Japan and win this war, and save American lives. So, like, get over yourself and get to work. So, like, any sort of racist attitude was really sort of overwhelmed by the sense of patriotic duty. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a beautiful expression of a fair amount of positive, and a little bit of negative social pressure to break this color divide. Another story of a Mexican American who does not necessarily catch in a lot of history books, but is a little bit more famous, is a guy named Guy Luis Galdabon. That he is a young Mexican American man. When the war breaks out, he's only 17 years old. He also was growing up in East Los Angeles, and he's from a really large family. And he was one of the younger in the family. His parents both worked all the time. They weren't around, played as an active role in his life as some of the older kids had, that kind of stuff. So he became really close friends with a Japanese American family that lived down the street, and they had some kids that were his age. And he ended up going to their house all the time, eating dinners. He eventually learns how to speak Japanese, learns a lot about Japanese culture. And almost becomes, kind of an adopted member of the family, practically, unofficially. But when the war breaks out, he is, inspired to join up and, and defend his country. So he joins the Marines, and he's sent off to fight in the Pacific. Very early on in his career, he's in this Battle of Saipan. The American forces have basically surrounded this mountain where this Japanese base was built on into this mountainside that it was going to be really hard to get them out. They were just dug in like crazy, and Japanese soldiers were known for death before surrender, essentially. And they had all these sort of crazy ideas that, if the Americans capture you, they're going to torture you. Those people eat babies, all kinds of, they've been told all this horrible propaganda about Americans. So they were going to fight to the last man. But, so the Americans, there's a battle they're going to win, but it is going to be a bloody one all along the way. And on the first day of fighting, Galdabon kills 37 Japanese soldiers. And he's called the hero for this. At the end of the day, it's like, wow, you're so brave. Like it's amazing. You're such a great warrior. He's going to get a medal, for this. But internally, he feels horrible because he didn't like killing people, and he didn't like killing people that look like his friends back home, his semi-adopted family back home. And he's like, I know Japanese people. I know that they are not bad people. A lot of the Americans, didn't know anything about Japanese culture. He's like, I do, and it's just ridiculous that shooting them is the best way to be able to do this. So he gets his plan, and he goes rogue, and goes up one night up into the mountain, and he gets the drop on 3 Japanese soldiers. And he's got his gun. He's like, all right, I got you guys, you're captured. And first of all, they're like, whoa, you just spoke to us in Japanese. Like that's crazy. Like, no Americans speak Japanese. And he said, yeah, I speak Japanese. And it notices, like, they're skinny, from hunger. Their uniforms are ragged. Some of them look a little sick. And he's just like, hey, if you surrender to us, we're going to take good care of you. We take great care of our POWs. So, come down the mountain, and like, we got medical care and food and all the stuff you need. And they're inclined to believe it. Because they're like, well, this guy speaks Japanese. We're told, no Americans do that. And he seems really sincere and friendly. We're in this bad position here. Maybe we should, go along with this. And so they agree to surrender. And he's like, well, do you guys know anybody else who might want to surrender? And like, yeah, we do. Like, a lot of us are in a real bad way up here. So we would like, we want to surrender. So Galdabon holds some of them hostage. Holds one guy hostage, and the 2 other guys go out and round up a few more people and come back. And he's like, all right, great. More of you are going to surrender. Does anybody else know anybody who might want to surrender? And like, yeah, sure. Like, we think we do. So they go out and ask, hey, does anybody else want to surrender? Turns out they got food and aid, and this really nice guy, he speaks Japanese, is really cool. Come on, let's go surrender. So more people do. And for 8 hours, more and more people are leaving and coming back and leaving and coming back until Galdabon comes down the mountainside with 1,000 Japanese people who had surrendered, 800 soldiers and 200 civilians who had surrendered to one guy, one Mexican American man who spoke Japanese with his language skills, his compassion, his multiculturalism that you couldn't have anywhere else in the world were way more important than his gun. There's no other country in the world. There's no other, and really almost no other state besides California that would produce a soldier like Guy Luis Galdabon. He is his heritage of growing up in diverse Los Angeles, and this is a huge win, in winning this battle. The Japanese can't hold out as much after that. He's awarded the Navy Cross. There was a movie made about him in the 1960s called Hell to Eternity. Not From Here to Eternity. That's a very famous movie. Hell to Eternity, very different. Apparently it's not a very good movie, but this is, again, California, diversity, multiculturalism, winning battles out there, way better than anything else. I love that story. So why we're talking about Mexican Americans, we'll start with the Bracero program, which really affected Mexican immigrants more than it did Mexican Americans. This is, it wasn't just factories and things like that they needed people to go work in for when the war starts. It's also farms. White American farmers enlisted to go fight in the war too, and they're going off to the front lines. So there was a shortage of workers, to do the important agricultural work that needed to be done. So the U.S. made a deal with Mexico to send up Mexican migrants to work on basically a temporary program. The farmers would set them up with everything that they need to live on the farm. They'd be there for a few months. They get paid really well, and they go home. This bracero means basically is like manual labor, mean like, you know, arm work, but you know, it's just sort of you know, one who works with their arms kind of thing. Um, and you know, the farmer has to provide adequate shelter, food, and sanitation, give them minimum wage, which was 30 cents an hour at the time. I know, not a lot, but that's minimum wage for the time. Um, and they would, the Mexican government would hold on to like some of their wages to make sure like they would, that money, you know, they give them the money once they got back to Mexico to be sure that money would get spent in Mexico. And this is kind of a win-win for everybody in this. And the white American farmers loved this. This was amazing. These guys were great workers who didn't complain as much. They didn't unionize. We don't think of unions being a thing on farms, but they definitely were in the 1930s and 40s. And these guys, not only did they, you know, not seem to want to unionize, it was in the Bracero deal that they couldn't unionize and ask for more money. So these guys are basically doing a better job than Americans and having less trouble. So when the war ends, they say, we got to continue doing this. Like, let's keep this program going. And of course, the agricultural industry has, you know, has deep pockets. They have lobbyists in Washington. You know, they're able to convince politicians to keep the Bracero program going, and it's going to last until 1964. But it's been a great program if it had it just ended in the war years, because when those Americans come back and want to get their jobs back, they're going to find these Mexican migrants doing their work. And you could probably guess they're not necessarily going to blame the farmers or you know, the farm owners, or you know, the lobbyists who keep this going, or the politicians who vote to keep it going. They're going to blame not having their jobs on the Mexican men. They're going to say these guys stole our jobs. And you know, we want to get them back. And this is really one of the beginnings of when we see a huge rise in you know, a sort of anti-Mexican sentiment. You know, where Americans are going to start becoming more concerned with the southern border. And that first sense of like, oh, they're stealing our jobs, really becomes a thing. And it's not great for the Mexican migrant workers either, because over time, their wages don't go up. You know, cost of living is going to keep going up. Inflation, it keeps happening, but they're still making 30 cents an hour. The farmers aren't taking as good a care of, you know, of their facilities and things like that. They know they can exploit these guys, and these guys can't complain. So they keep getting treated worse and worse and worse over time. And this is why by the 1960s, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Junta and the United Farm Workers, you know, one of the early part of that movement is going to be ending the Bracero program, for the benefit, you know, of everybody involved. You know, for white Americans, for, you know, for Mexican Americans, for Mexican migrants, for everybody, you know, to get rid of this deal that had gone on for way too long. And yeah, luckily in the group project, some of you are going to be talking about United Farm Workers, so that's awesome. So, still keeping in the theme of Mexican Americans in California, not everything was, you know, we see some good stuff happening, and we see some gray area. Not everything was necessarily rosy. I got someone scratching at my door here. You coming in? I'm going to be in here for like 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm safe in here. He wants to come and make sure I'm safe. And he's going to leave. So in 1942, it is a year into the war, Los Angeles was rocked by a murder at a quarry. It was called the Sleepy Lagoon quarry, or that's an odd name for it, but there was a man that was murdered there, supposedly by 9 Mexican-American teenagers. And this really brought out a lot of sort of anti-Mexican sentiment. there's already a sense that like, oh, these guys are thugs, these guys are juvenile delinquents and hooligans and stuff like that. And that really heightens that attitude around Los Angeles. Like there's all kinds of reporting of the scandals of what was done to this man out there. And I honestly don't know the details of this murder, and it doesn't really matter. Really, just this is the rise in the anti-American sentiment. And there was another thing that was going on while this is happening that had to do with fashion. Zoot suits. You see these big baggy suits that they had, was just the style at the time for not just young Mexican American men, and not just in California, around the country. Black men, Mexican Americans. I know there was a huge Filipino zoot suit thing. It's the same sort of fashion statements that we would associate with young men who are want to look hard kind of thing. This was the version of that. So everybody associates the zoot suits with this sort of juvenile delinquency kind of thing. And during the war, that gets compounded by the fact that they use too much cloth, because everything gets rationed during the war. Every spare bit of resource and material needs to go into the war effort. So regular Americans, getting eggs was a little bit harder. Yeah, and dairy in some cases. Rubber was incredibly hard to get. For your car, if your tire goes out, it's going to be really expensive to get a new tire. And cloth was one of those things that had to be rationed. And here were these guys walking around, who everybody thinks is thugs anyway, wearing clothes. You could fit two people into this. You can make two suits out of what these guys have. So it's excessive that they see it. And eventually, at one point, Los Angeles outlaws the zoot suit. And there's like an underground zoot suit market and stuff like that. It's crazy how much there was like conversation around all that. But this reaches a height in the summer of 1943 when fights start breaking out between young Mexican American men wearing zoot suits and naval cadets. Los Angeles was also an epicenter or like a hub, I guess, for the U.S. Navy. Going down to the Pacific, there were schools here, camps and training and things like that. Sending guys out to fight in the Pacific, or when they come back, they would be stationed in Los Angeles for a little while before going back out. There's all kinds of sailors that are going in and out of here, and they're coming from all parts around the country. Most of them aren't from California. Most of them have not grown up with the kind of diversity that we have in California. A lot of them coming from the South and things like that. A lot of them are racist. And in general, young men in general don't need a lot of reason to fight. They're looking for reasons to go beat people up and things like that. And apparently, like a fight had broken out. Legend has it, we don't know the details of it, this is true or not, but basically some sailors were hollering at some young Latinas. The Latino boys didn't like that, and like, hey, why are you coming into our neighborhood and hollering at our girls? And a fight breaks out that ended with a one of the sailors getting his jaw broken. So he's in the Navy hospital with his jaw, and when the other sailors find out about this, they want revenge. So they go, so you start getting these retaliatory attacks across Los Angeles. And the zoot suit plays a particular role in it because everybody was mad at them anyway. So this turns into a thing of basically the sailors going out at night with clubs and stuff like this, axe handles, baseball bats, things like that, looking for anybody in a zoot suit and beating the shit out of them. And then in a lot of cases, stripping the zoot suit off of them. Sometimes they would light it on fire. There gross cases of them peeing on these guys or on the zoots and stuff like that. I know, like, it's gross to talk about, but I don't know. I feel like that sort of, disrespect is worth putting in here. And as far as I know, nobody died, but we ended up being 150 people injured. And the cops have to, start putting in curfews and start arresting people. Of course, most of the people they arrest are the young Latino men. They arrest over 500 Latinos for rioting and vagrancy. And it wasn't just like, I should say they were getting attacked more, but these things were going both ways, for sure. And there's not a ton more to say. Eventually things get wind down about it. This does, Eleanor Roosevelt had wrote a letter about, to what was going on that was printed in newspapers, saying the question goes deeper than just the suits. It is racial protest. I have been worried for a long time about the Mexican racial situation. It is a problem with roots going back a long way, and we do not always face these problems as we should. She was trying to make a diplomatic case there of being that, like, this isn't about suits, this isn't about sort of juvenile delinquency, this is about us not treating people of different races the way we should. Miss Roosevelt was always active in trying to combat racism. One of the sort of the few people that'd be out there at this time being like, hey, let's all be a little bit less racist. And she was trying to sort of talk people down with that. Okay, I don't need to do anything else on that. Okay, so as you've seen in this class over the last few lectures, that race is becoming even like a bigger and more important part of the conversation. Anthony, you okay? Drink some water. So, race is, at the forefront of people's minds. We've seen, this is when eugenics, is still happening. People are still, like, they think of everything in terms of race, and very much thinking of, like, your genetics and your race dictates a lot about you. You are, if a few people of a certain race are, like, are this way, that, that means that these character traits run throughout everybody of that race. And, while, on individual levels and in certain pockets, like we've seen, Lockheed Martin and at the Kaiser shipyard and things like that, these racial barriers are breaking down. But in the larger culture in the US and in California, people very much still think of everything in terms of race. And that was, very much talked about in this. And I should point out, Japan was also doing this too. Japan was also a racist empire, with racist means, and was also, talking about the U.S. in, an incredibly racist ways, and depicting the U.S. as being like big, hairy monsters, and as brutes, and this kind of stuff. They're depicting Franklin Roosevelt. He's got these like kind of wolfman teeth here and everything. But and then on the American side, you see like this, these type of things is very common and sort of American propaganda for a long time. Like anything like a threat to white women is like, if you nothing gets people more riled up on and ready to murder than the idea of young white American women, being ravaged, by people of color. That's just constantly used throughout American history to get people going. And lots of the propaganda posters you'll notice have, naked or half naked women, so like that being, attacked and things like this. And Japanese soldier is like ape-like in this, like he's less evolved or something like that. So you get the idea. I don't need to go into any more detail than that. But the most common word that was associated with Japan when the war breaks out is treacherous. The attack on Pearl Harbor was treacherous. They sucker punched us. Like they, with little provocation, because all we did was not sell them oil, and and they destroyed. They killed a bunch of American soldiers. They were our ally, and they betrayed us. And there was this common theme to hit: the Japanese people are inherently treacherous people. You hear that over and over again, and we've seen a growing number of Japanese Americans in the United States. Even though Japanese immigration was technically illegal after 1924, there were a lot of Japanese Americans before, and then we saw them brought over picture brides as people that had families. By the 1940s, people have been here for a few generations. And there's a fair amount of off the books immigration still coming in before World War II begins. But you have all of this. We have a bunch of Japanese Americans, mainly in California. Washington had a fair amount of them. Washington State, but they're along the West Coast for the most part. And this also happens to be the exact same place where we're building new factories and shipyards and aerospace, hangars, and all of these things that that are going up for the war effort that needs to happen in California. That's also where all the Japanese Americans live, and everybody's saying these people are inherently treacherous, and everybody's expecting there could easily be attack on California from a Japanese fleet. They could be landing troops in San Francisco. Like people are, on Ocean Beach. They're coming out, and what if they're getting help? What if there's Japanese Americans who are sending them radio signals, or they're doing something to let them know where locations are and stuff like that? Or what if they're going to try and sabotage one of the factories? They're going to throw a bomb into the Kaiser shipyard, that kind of stuff. Like, again, it sounds sort of ridiculous from our perspective, but at the time, this was huge. Even without the racial component, I understand why people were scared of surprise attacks, but you add the racial part onto that legitimate fear, and people are going to do horrible things. And they're going to do one of the worst and most racist things the U.S. government has ever done. To at least say with slavery, the U.S. government had permitted slavery, but it didn't actively conduct. The U.S. government didn't own slaves. Though, of course, slavery lasted much, much longer. Many more people suffered under it. But for something that the American government was actually doing to people, American citizens, this is about as bad as it gets. And there had been this sort of growing drumbeat, like, we need to do something about these people. Maybe I should still be on this slide. We need to do something about all these Japanese people that are treacherous. They're along the West Coast. Like, it's super dangerous, and there's no evidence. Like Roosevelt and even J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, who is known for being paranoid and racist, he even said there's no evidence for this sort of Japanese fifth column threat in the United States. But that didn't stop people from this constant beat. We need to keep our facilities safe. We need to do something about the treacherous Japanese population. This Lieutenant General John DeWitt would tell newspapers, we need to put these people in prison, because he said, I don't want any of them here, meaning people of Japanese ancestry. I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen. He is still Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty, but we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. Crazy. More famously, he said in front of Congress, one of the few times I'll use racial slurs in this class, he said, "A Jap is a Jap." And this is why, it's not going to be just, non-citizens. It is going to be citizens that they're going to do this to. One of the biggest voices calling for internment here in California was the Attorney General of California, who was a rising star in politics, Earl Warren. And he had his eyes set on being governor of California one day, and maybe even presidential hopes, things like that. He says the Japanese situation as it exists in the state today may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civilian defense effort. So he's ringing this drum, ringing this bell, beat a drum, and he'll be, successful in, convincing President Roosevelt to enact Japanese internment. If the name Earl Warren sounds familiar to you at all, then you know some history. He will eventually go on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He does become governor of California in the late 1940s. It's very popular. Everything he's calling for Japanese internment is very popular, and that helps him get elected into the governor's office. In 1950, he runs for vice president, loses that election, but then a few years later is appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And he will decide the very famous Brown versus Board of Education decision, which says no more segregation in public schools. This is the first dismantling of the Jim Crow South, ending racial segregation in the United States. And he will be incredibly important to the civil rights movement in general. When he does that, he sends a signal to civil rights leaders, to people like Martin Luther King, hey, there are liberals on the Supreme Court that want to dismantle the racist system in the United States. And Warren will be a tireless advocate for that. One of the reasons he does is because he feels guilty about his role in internment. That he knows what he did, and he thought it was right at the time. He thought it was smart politically, but he would see it would ruin over 100,000 people's lives. And later on, he would say in his memoirs, I've since deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with the American concept of freedom and the rights of citizen. Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from their homes, school friends, congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. It was wrong to react so impulsively without positive evidence of disloyalty. But again, that's in hindsight. Warren and others like him in the 40s are advocating for internment, will win the day, and Franklin Roosevelt will sign Executive Order 9066. This is just 3 months after Pearl Harbor, which in this executive order, it does not mention the Japanese specifically. It just authorizes military commanders to designate military areas where any and all persons may be excluded. It just gives the permission to say, like, if you need to detain any people for any reason, they can do that. But everybody knew this was going to be aimed at the Japanese. They did detain a small number of Italian and German Americans and German American immigrants. But the difference is going to be that they only arrested those people for if they suspected active disloyalty, if there was some reason to think that they might be, helping the enemy. For Japanese Americans, simply having their Japanese blood was enough of reason to lock them up. And yeah, they're going to detain 130,000 people. I'm going to go to this map first. So what they're essentially going to do is draw this line down Washington, down Oregon, all of California, and then part of Arizona here, saying all Japanese people or people of Japanese descent that live on this side of the line, you have to submit yourself to local assembly centers, and you're going to be indefinitely detained. If you're a Japanese American person and you lived, just across the line over here in Las Vegas, you'd be okay. You wouldn't it's only seen to be a threat if you live along the coast here. The vast majority of people of Japanese descent who lived in the United States lived on this side of the line. They had been immigrating into California and places like that, and settling here. There was not a lot of Japanese Americans who'd gone out into other parts of the country. One sort of weird irony to this whole thing is that the one place that we actually were attacked, on American soil, in Hawaii, there was no detainment order because there were so many people of Japanese American descent or of Japanese descent in Hawaii that it was basically a third of the population, and they'd have to shut down the entire state. And it was actually the military commanders there who said, for the war effort, for us to really conduct the war, we need these people. So they only detained people in Hawaii that they specifically suspected of aiding the enemy, and everybody else went about their day, which is just kind of. I should say that they did have to periodically check in with the government and say what they've been doing, but they were not actively detained. So when the internment order goes out, they're not going to send U.S. soldiers out kicking down doors and pulling people out of homes and putting them into camps. Not like that. They put up these notifications all up and down the West Coast saying, all persons of Japanese ancestry, living in this area, follow these instructions. And they're going to have to go to these assembly centers. They're going to turn themselves in. Eventually, there will be people that will go out and look for Japanese people who did not turn themselves in. The majority, most Japanese Americans will turn themselves in. They're going to want to prove they're law-abiding citizens, that they have nothing to hide. And they're going to hope that the government isn't going to do anything too monstrous to them. They're going to hope that this works out one way or another. But kind of going on run from the law is a kind of scary idea. But again, 62% of all of the internees are going to be American citizens, born in the United States. People that had been here for generations. Their grandparents had come over from Japan, and for all intents and purposes, I shouldn't say for all intents and purposes, they are Americans, citizens. Grew up speaking English. Going to American schools. All of that are going to still be sent away with not even an allegation of disloyalty. And then I'm like, oh, we suspect that you might have been doing something specific. Just be like, if you are Japanese, then that's enough for us to tell you that you are disloyal, and you have to turn yourself in. So they're going to be assembly centers. You can also see on this map where these different assembly centers were. The closest one to us, assuming you live, in the East Bay, like I do, with Tanaforian over here. Is it? Now I'm blanking if it's Daly City. I think it is in Daly City. It's a mall now. The Tanaforian Mall, but I think it's in Daly City. Yeah, could be at Colma. South San Francisco. The borders there, I always forget. But at the time, it was a racetrack, horse racing track, and those were kind of a popular thing for the use as assembly centers because it's sort of big open areas that they can sort of house people. These are going to be open for a few months where people come turn themselves in. They're going to be housed temporarily. They can kind of get their affairs in order a little bit because they can, if they have friends and stuff nearby that they can help manage things for them. Say, can you look after my car or my house and stuff like that? At least they're still close to home. But they're basically there because they have to build the camps. They have to build the prisons. We didn't have a bunch of prisons sitting around to send these people to, so they're going to have to build them in certain areas. So for a little while, they're going to live at these assembly centers. No, San Bruno. I do have it on there. Okay. And you sort of see things like this of, people getting put onto trains, with nothing but, a suitcase at the pack, lightly, what they can carry, essentially for who knows how long, and leave everything behind. And being put on the trains, and this is kind of reminiscent, at least with, and this, I cut this picture of Nazi Waits is sort of scary that he putting on people on trains and stuff. This is World War II. People are being sent into concentration camps in Germany. Jewish people their death camps are being sent to. One of the reasons that the U.S. thought this was, an acceptable thing to do, because other countries were doing similar things to ethnic minority populations that they were suspicious of. So it was like, well, this is just a thing we're doing at the time. So, we're going to send people to concentration camps too. They did not know the extent of what was going on in Germany, as far as people being put to death in Dachau and Auschwitz and things like that. But it is kind of scary to think of, these people being packed on trains. They don't know what the hell is going to happen to them being sent away. This guard does look like, at least he's his body language doesn't look like he's not hitting them over the head with a gun and pushing them onto the train, kind of thing. It looks like he's explaining something to them. At least it's a little, it's still not Nazi Germany. But anyway, I want to back up here. The idea of leaving everything behind is crazy. Like your homes, your businesses, like all your possessions, all of that stuff, like for who knows how long. And like there's a point people sort of forget about, that they're not just losing their freedom, they're losing their entire lives. And I worked on a project. I helped write a book with two history professors at CSU East Bay. They were my former professors when I was a student there. Now they're friends of mine, but Dr. Kevin Katz and Dr. Linda Ivey. We were working on, they found all these letters that from families that lived in Redwood City. There's a particularly large population of Japanese Americans that are farmers in Redwood City, out on the peninsula. And they all got detained and sent off to different camps around the country. And they were incredibly lucky because they had a banker who lived in Redwood City. This guy named Moorish, James E. Moorish, who agreed to try and help them out, help try and like rent out their places, collect rent, sell anything they need, send something out if they wanted like a sewing machine sent out, they would send it out. He was at least somebody that they could trust, who would help manage their things, their lives, and things like that, so they wouldn't lose everything. And this guy's basically a saint as far as I'm concerned, because he helped do this for like 25 different, or no, like 18 different families, on top of his regular job. It's not his job to do all this stuff, but he's trying to make sure that these people are getting a fair deal, because most Japanese Americans did not have somebody like that they could trust. It was a relatively insulated community where Japanese American hung out with other Japanese Americans, and they weren't necessarily friends with white people and things like that. So for a lot of people, they had to say, like, to their white neighbors, can you watch over my house or my car or whatever? And as soon as they leave, well, yeah, you're never seeing that stuff ever again. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, I sold your car, and you know, you're sitting in a prison. Yeah, how are you going to prove that was ever yours? Or they collect rent on the house and keep it for themselves, or sell the house, and things like that. So there were many Americans who exploited this situation because they knew the owners were never going to be able to do anything about it. They're to the end of the war, they're going to be off in some camp somewhere. But at least the people I got to study, they, the letters I was reading, my job was essentially to read all of these letters between this banker and these families. And most of it is kind of boring stuff of like, can you send us a sewing machine? Oh, I heard somebody wants to buy your rototiller tractor, do you want to sell it? Kind of boring stuff in there. But, you really get a sense of how difficult it is to manage your life when you're sitting in a camp in some desert, far eastern part of California. And these were in very remote places, like that they built up. They did it away from city centers, so they're all in the middle of nowhere. A lot of them are out in the middle of the desert, built up kind of ad hoc. And Manzanar is one of the most famous ones. I think probably the closest to us as well. Where's my map? You see Manzanar right here is this big triangle there. And one of the few, there's only two that were actually in California. Most of them were sent out in the Great Basin area, very deserty places out there. In a lot of cases, they had to continue building the prison as they got there. They helped put up the walls and the dormitory buildings and things like that. Because like I said, it wasn't completed, so it's kind of insane where if you're a prisoner who has to build your own prison. You could try and earn extra money. Sometimes you could go work at farms nearby and things like that, because things still cost money. Like the government provided a certain amount of of food and things like that, but like if you wanted new clothes, if anything that you would need, you need. This is America. Everything costs money, but of course you can't make money when you're sitting in Manzanar prison camp. But sometimes kids, especially young men, would be able to go out and work at farms nearby to try and raise up a little bit of extra money for the family. Wait in line for everything, that you're doing. God damn. Yeah, everything's okay in here. You're just gonna want to go back out in just a minute. So, it sounds like small that you have to wait in line to, but like, imagine when you're hungry that you can go to the kitchen and just make something to eat. You have to wait until it's lunchtime, and then you have to be able to sit. Everybody comes in and is brought into this type of seating to be able to eat. You're eating sort of cafeteria style, and I'm like, for some reason, for me, that always is sort of a sticking point of like. There's so many ways of being able, like, I could try and manage my own life, but of not being able to like eat when I want to, and having to wait in line for everything, like, it's just incredibly annoying when you're at home and you want things to be comfortable. I don't know. When I was a kid, I got arrested for train hopping in Klamath Falls, Oregon. When I was like 21, and I got caught and arrested, and I spent 3 days in jail. And I knew I was going to get out in 3 days, so it really wasn't that bad. I just did a lot of reading. I read Rosemary's Baby and Johnny Cash, Man in Black, and I was, I'm just gonna kick it. But the thing that bugged me was like I would be sitting in there reading my book. I'm like, I'm kind of hungry. in between meals, and there's this giant metal door between me and the food. Like, and that was the thing that had always really stuck with me, that like of losing my freedom, as being that like I can't eat when I want to. I don't know, and I think about that being the case for these internees. They did their best to manage as they could. These were not the most sanitary of conditions out in the middle of the desert. It's windy. They have all kinds of dust storms going back and forth. A lot of these places were not built particularly strongly, and you have multiple families living. You have these kind of like these long houses that you might have 2 or 3 families living in, and they talk about this dust being in everything. It gets through the cracks, and you just, that dust of the desert is just constantly coating everything you have. So that is incredibly frustrating. But they managed it. They did their best to live their life. They go back to normal. They're playing baseball. Well, they're Americans, doing that kind of stuff. Kids playing. They tried to manage the best they could. They complained remarkably little. In all those letters I read, you really do not see that much complaining about their conditions. They're hoping that Americans will change their mind. They're hoping the war will end so they can go home. They're worried about things, but they don't complain. I would be so pissed. I'd be railing against the government, my government, that I'm a citizen of, if kept me in a prison camp for no reason, I'd be pissed. But they took particular pride in being stoic about this. Of course, it's very cold in the winter, hot in the summer in a lot of these places. That adds to that. I already said about farming. They had their own farms. They could work at other farms nearby. And at the end of the day, like, you're in prison. There are guard towers with men with rifles, and there's barbed wire between you and the rest of the world. We would consider to be sort of minimum security, because there's not a lot of places, not anywhere you could really go in this case. But again, it's kind of impossible to contemplate, and not knowing how long the war is going to go on. It will be there until the end of the war, and you just don't know how long that's going to be. One of the things that the government will do is ask them to sign loyalty oaths about this, even though this is being done to them. One of the things here: are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? Like, again, if that was me, you guys detained me and my entire family for no reason, and you asking me to fight for you for this country? Many of them are going to say yes. I'll talk about that in a minute. I would not be able to, to rise to that same level of that. But like I said, a lot of them are going to want to prove that they are model citizens. I'm going to look at this other question here. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign and domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Now, a lot of them refused to sign this part not because of the swearing unqualified allegiance to the United States of America. This is, yeah, that's fine. I'm on board for that. The thing is that forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor. Now, if you're forswearing allegiance, if you're saying, I no longer have allegiance to the Japanese emperor, that implies you did have allegiance. And I don't have this anymore, so it means you did once have it. And then, people that said, I was born in America, I came here a long time ago, I knew nothing about the Japanese empire, I don't want nothing to do with them. I'm not going to forswear allegiance because I never had any allegiance to them in the first place. So that would be sort of the sticking point on this. And they're good, especially at times like these too. The government would use that kind of stuff against you later on. Like, oh, you said something here that you once had allegiance, to the government. So a lot of them refuses, a foreign protest to not sign that part. But like I said, many young men would sign the first part of the there and would go to war, and the military wouldn't let them go fight in the Pacific. They said, we can't trust you to fight against your Japanese brothers, that kind of thing. So they could only fight in the European theater of the war. And this is when the U.S. military was segregated. So there was an all-Japanese American unit. And this was the 442nd Regiment combat team. It becomes the most decorated unit in American history, all of American history. More medals and awards and valor goes to these guys than anybody else. For one thing, they had something to prove, but they also they're going to be given the worst assignments. If they're in Italy and there's some machine gun embankment at the top of this hill that is mowing people down trying to go up there. Send the Japanese guys, they're basically half the enemy anyway. So, if anybody's going to get killed trying to do this thing, we're sending up the 442nd. And they're basically used as like cannon fodder. But the thing is, they did it, and they suffered heavy losses, but they did it every time. And after a while, people were like, dude, these guys are badass fighters, and they don't complain. They get the hardest stuff, and they get award. Their commanders still realized, yeah, we gave you a shit task and you completed it when we didn't think anybody else would be able to do that. So they get all kinds of accolades for that and become, again, like I said, the most decorated unit in American military history. Here's the capturing a Nazi flag here, escorting some German prisoners. One of the letters that I had read, I didn't read any letters from anybody from the 442nd, but one of the sisters was, and she was updating Moorish about it. And this guy had gotten shot 3 separate times. I think it was like once in Italy and twice in France, and sent to the hospital. And he kept wanting to go back to the front lines every time. And so, it's commendable bravery, no doubt. So near the end of the war, when it's clear the war is going to end, before the war officially ends, but as it is winding down, as Japan is becoming less of a threat, their capabilities of attacking U.S. is basically null. By 1945, they start releasing people in the camps and sending them home. And basically, good luck. Go back, starting your lives. Like, oh yeah, like everything you had is gone, but yeah. Well, this is America. What you gonna do about it? And they're gonna go home to a lot of people who see Japanese faces as the face of the enemy still. And you see a lot of this horrible kind of racism, and there's going to be a lot of sort of discrimination against Japanese people for generations. But as people still remember them as the enemy during the war. So they're going to have 2 challenges coming back. They're if their houses are still there, they've been abandoned for 4 or 5 years, and all of their neighbors are going to be looking side-eye at them. They're going to have to completely rebuild from scratch everything. So it's just again, it's done for no reason by the American government. But in the 1960s, different civil rights movements would inspire its own sort of Japanese American civil rights movement. And there were a lot of the younger people in the camps would begin to say, like, hey, we need to acknowledge what was done to us, how unjust this was. A lot of the older generation was like, we don't talk about that. We just pretend that never happened. We're keeping our heads down and going to work. And we're just like, there was a lot of shame associated with it. But the younger generation was saying, like, hey, no, we want to talk about this. Very famously, one of the most famous internees was George Takei, George Takei. I still say Takei, but yeah, George Takei, Sulu from Star Trek, from the old Star Trek. Especially in the 1960s, he was, when he's on the TV show, he's probably the biggest Japanese American celebrity, and he had been, when he was a little kid, he had grown up in the camps, and he's been a huge advocate for basically never forget what was done to us. Eventually, in 1976, President Gerald Ford was the first to acknowledge that internment was wrong and said it was a national mistake which should never be repeated. And then finally, in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed a bill for reparations for $20,000 for each surviving detainee. Again, this is more than 40 years later. This is like, a lot of those people were not still alive. They had died in that time, and they had gone a long way towards rebuilding their lives in those 40 years. So it's, I don't know if it's necessarily too little, but yeah, too little, too late, essentially. But they do end up paying out, $1.2 billion, which gives you a sense, again, for how many people they had put into prison. And all of this, like, we think of this type of thing as being like, for a long time, we thought that this couldn't happen here again. My entire life, I thought this couldn't happen here again. But in the last few years, I think it's starting to look a little more realistic, of this type of thing happening. When Trump was running for president, a spokesman for his super PAC, a guy named Carl Higbee, was on Fox News, saying that, advocating for a program to start registering and possibly detaining American Muslims. And he said, we've done it based on race, we've done it based on religion, we've done it based on region. By the way, we have not done it based on religion. It had nothing to do with it, but based on race and region, yeah, more or less. But we did it, done it based on race, we've done it based on religion, we've done it based on region. We did it during World War II to the Japanese. And the host he was talking to on Fox was Megyn Kelly. And she said, are you advocating for having new internment camps? And so I'm just saying there's a precedent for it. So, rather than looking back on this as being like a national horror of like, this should never be repeated, people are like, well, we've done it before, so we could do it again. And, sure enough, during the Trump administration, we've seen, as people, got stopping everybody at the border, and not having nowhere to put people, one of the facilities that they had put, Central American people trying to get into the United States, was an old internment camp, it was an old Japanese American internment camp in Texas. Said, well, this is a prison we have just sitting here. Let's start putting people there. So yeah, it's a scary idea that only, 70 years later that something like this could happen again. How soon we forget these type of injustices. One other little side effect of this, like I said, I've been talking more about the African American population and kind of the Great Migration in the next lecture. But a sort of strange, weird thing was, as many Japanese Americans were having to go into the camps, that is right at the same time that there's all these Black Southern migrants moving into these big cities looking for somewhere to live, and they're having a hard time finding places. A lot of people won't rent to them, and they're able to move into old Japanese American houses. So you have these sort of switch. There was never a particularly large, not in the same way that Chinatown was, but but there was a little Tokyo in Los Angeles, and in just a few short years, by the time the Japanese Americans get home, they find Black people living in their neighborhood. Now it's known as Bronzeville, which has its own racial connotations to that. And there's going to be some problems. Neighborhood had changed quite a bit in that time. Um, and both of these groups are finding discrimination, having a hard time finding places to live, kind of for slightly different reasons, and now having to live on top of each other, and there's all kinds of conflict that comes to that. But it's also a lot of sympathy in the African American community for being like, hey, yeah, we have to live through slavery. We understand what what was being done to you, was wrong. And in the civil rights movement, into the 1950s and 60s, there would be a kind of disproportionate number of Japanese Americans like working as part of the civil rights movement, because there was this kind of historic alliance because of that. So I don't know. It's just sort of a weird footnote in California history that have these two groups mingling in this way because of these sort of historic discriminations. Okay, getting close to the end here. Now you might be wondering, well, what about other Asian people? What about the large Chinese American population in Chinatowns and things like that? You could probably expect that most Americans, most white people, did not necessarily see a difference in looking at, when they see an Asian person, they don't know if the person is Japanese or Chinese, how they're directing their hate. It's not like they were big fans of the Chinese before, certainly. So they actually had these buttons that, that said, I'm Chinese, to say like, don't report me to the police or anything like that, like I'm actually Chinese. It's just kind of crazy to be walking around with those. There were a small amount of Japanese people who were able to hide amongst the Chinese population. They were able to basically pass as Chinese for a few years. It's kind of rare because you don't just do that for, you're gonna have to say like, oh, this is our cousin, and say like, some guy whose name is, Watanabe, is now gonna hide under the name Wong, like, it's not something you don't do for people you don't know. And there was particularly a lot of animosity between the Chinese and Japanese people because, well, Japan was invading China, as we've said. And this is where things really began to change for the Chinese population, because the Chinese American population was super pro-war. They were as enthusiastic, if not more, than anybody else, because for them, this war was not just about the US winning. This is about freedom for their relatives, for their homeland. And pushing the Japanese people out of China. So they were very much in favor of America going to, allying with China and fighting. And America is an ally. America and ally are China. America and China are allies throughout the entire war against Japan. And in American Chinatowns, there would be parades like this. This is in San Francisco Chinatown, these sort of pro-war parades. There was lots of Chinese Americans that wanted to enlist to fight. There was all, sort of support in terms of, they were really strict in rationing or buying war bonds and things like that. And having this sort of breakdown, we're having this shift in China-American relations, made Americans look at Chinese people differently, and to a certain extent, made Chinese Americans look at the rest of white America differently. They had more in common. They had a common enemy. They had a common cause, where they had not before. For a long time, Americans had this thought as the Chinese as the forever foreigner. Doesn't matter how many generations or people have lived here. Now it's like, oh, you were with us helping us fight this war. And you're reading the books, reading Fifth Chinese Daughter, and you begin to see this opening up of Chinatown, where that invisible wall around Chinatown starts to disappear, and Americans start coming in. Chinese Americans start going out. This is when Americans they discover Chinese food is super delicious. All of that, in just a few decades, right in the heart of Chinatown, Grant Avenue becomes a tourist attraction. Like Chinatown now, like is more of a tourist attraction than anything else in most people's minds as you walk down Grant. Right, as the thing where people in the 1940s up in white people didn't go there, so it is a dramatic shift. And but there it's not easy to get over centuries, or not centuries, but decades of discrimination, of being treated badly, being told you can't. The Japanese Exclusion Act is still in effect, and saying Chinese people cannot be citizens, saying we do not allow Chinese people to come into this country, and Japan was very much aware of this and was trying to drive a wedge between China and Americans, and between Chinese Americans and the rest of white America. And they had sort of propaganda efforts with books and flyers and radio broadcasts and sort of things like that to convince Chinese people that the U.S. is not really your ally. They say you're your ally now, but that's only until basically they're going to conquer Japan, and then they're going to conquer the rest of Asia. And yes, sure, Japan is conquering, is invading China, but that's an inter-Asian thing. We are Asians. We're working out this problem. Don't bring the West into this. As soon as we invite the West into this, they're going to conquer all of it. So, and the thing that they were able to point to, it sounds sort of ridiculous. Like, yeah, we're invading your country and killing your people, but America is the real threat. But one of the things that rang true in this argument was the Chinese Exclusion Act. For decades, the first time that we discriminated anybody based on race in this country as official policy and law was against Chinese people. And Chinese people were very much aware of that they were put very low on the totem pole in this way. And as long as the Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect, this Japanese propaganda argument did make some sense to some people. And this begins to be why they talk about repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act. And there was even a American naval commander who testified in front of Congress that the Exclusion Act is worth 20 divisions of the Japanese army. They say that hurts us that much to have this continuously racist law in effect. And Roosevelt had kind of wanted to get rid of it anyway, but basically just needed the support to be able to do it. So he's able to convince Congress to finally lift the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is it. This is the end of it. Exclusion Act done. But the Immigration Act of 1924 is still in effect, where they have these quotas about how many people can come into the country. So they're only going to allow 105 new Chinese immigrants into the country. Because and the Exclusion Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924 is in effect until 1965. So that's when they finally get rid of all of all those restrictions. But Exclusion Act is gone, and Chinese Americans can become citizens. They're on the same playing field as everybody else. I'm sort of making a point of this because it's a short answer question you're going to have on your final about when the Chinese Exclusion Act began and why it ended. So this is more than like that. It ends here in 1943. I'm going to have some of you, even though I'm saying this right now, some of you are going to put it that it didn't end until 1965 because I have that here. That's not the right answer. It's 1943 is when it ended. It's just that they lifted the quotas on all of the immigration laws in 1965. So yeah, it's a different thing. But I'm saying now, I don't know, it makes me laugh because I know some people aren't going to watch this video. They're just going to look at this slide and give me the wrong answer. So I don't know, they lose points. Okay, so we've seen a lot of changes here. in this lecture. There's some good stuff happening for some people, for some racial minorities, some bad stuff happening for some racial minorities. Some kind of raising higher, some lower, some sort of evening out. Yeah, definitely Chinese people definitely benefited from the war. Japanese Americans obviously did not. Mexican Americans in California are still in the middle somewhere, so a little bit up, a little bit down. But the war itself changes so much about how Americans think about race. That sort of beginning to work alongside each other, like I talked about in the factories, that ends up being a big thing. And then sort of the patriotic cause, that begins to that breaks down certain barriers that weren't there before, and that will spread over time. It takes a long time, but it does spread. But more importantly, in a way, it's when Americans start realizing racism is a bad thing. When racism becomes a bad word. A big part of that is who we were fighting against. Like I said, they're fighting against Nazi Germany, obviously super racist. Also Imperial Japan, like I said, also pretty racist. And America comes into this war being like, we are the fighting for freedom and liberty and democracy and equality and all of the stuff in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and all that stuff. And there will be definitely among the Black community in Jim Crow South, they'll be like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not really going on. They're going to be able to make a lot of hay at that. But in general, people, like, when you're fighting against Nazis in Imperial Japan, it sort of holds up a dark mirror to who we were as a people, who the country was, and saying now, like, how far off are we from Nazi Germany if we have Jim Crow laws in effect, if we have the Exclusion Act in effect, if we have Japanese Americans put into internment camps? It kind of starts this question about how we think about race and racism. And it's kind of the beginning, but the civil rights movement is no accident that really comes about a decade later in the 1950s. It is a change in attitude. People, where it had been before being that, like, well, I don't want to give that person a job because I don't like the color of their skin. Like, people would be like, hey, it's kind of messed up. Like, that's not a good way to be. Like, that maybe that's not who we should be. And you're going to see changes in laws and things like that. So, and nowhere I think would that be more relevant than, of course, California, which is always one of the most diverse states in the country. Actually, the most diverse state in the country, and where all of these sort of different neighborhoods that had been separating people start to ease up, and people start becoming, actually multicultural rather than a pluralistic society of different little sub pockets. We all, begin to come one. World War II is the point where that happens. I think I said everything I wanted to say there. I think there's some other point on that, but I can't remember what it is now. But I don't know, maybe I'll think of it when we're talking about this in our meetings. All right. I will see you guys later.